Yeah, next we have one more term to define, which is called as a domain. Domain, or it is also called as a value set. Every attribute is associated with a domain or a value set of that particular attribute. So what does the domain indicate? Domain indicates the set of values that are allowed for that particular attribute. For example, if you consider age allowed for the employee is 16 to 70, so if the age allowed for an employee in a particular firm is 16 to 70, then we can specify, we can say that the domain of that attribute age in the table or in an entity employee is the integer values between 16 to 70. So integer between 16 to 70, this becomes a domain for the attribute age in that entity relation, in that entity employee, in the employee entity. Same thing when we take in, in relation with other entities, the domain may be different. Fine. So domain for BCA admission students, it may be integer value for the age, of course. It may be integer value between this to this. Like for example, another we can take domain for roll number for 4B students. What is the domain for 4B students for roll number? What are the numbers allowed for roll numbers for 4B students? What is the range? Yes, what's the range of roll numbers for 4B students?
Don't know, ma'am. Around 388 starts, I guess.
Yeah, approximately. It may
380 to 470
480
something.
to 480 to 500, maybe it starts with 400 now. Fine. So this is how you understood what is the range, and of course you have to say integer values. The domain for name attribute is alphabets ranging from A to Z. Fine. The combination of all these alphabets will become a domain of your name attribute. So this is what is domain. How to define a domain? Domain is a value set allowed for a particular attribute. And example is this, the age. Clear? So this is a frequently asked question for 2 marks in exam. So you have to remember this along with the example. Now, let us just quickly revise. Of course, we revise the shapes. Let's go ahead with the next term. Relationship. The next term, what we are, important term again, frequently asked, what is a relationship? Relationship relates two or more distinct entities with a specific meaning. So relationship exists between two entities. Now here the example given is the employee. See, we are talking about entity, not entity types right now. So employee is the entity type. That means it's a group of entities, among which there is a single entity called as John Smith. So employee John Smith works on the product X project. That means among multiple projects, there is one project called as product X on which employee John Smith works. So when we talk about the relationship between the entity John Smith and product X, what is the relationship? How do you talk about that relationship, or how do you define, which term do you use? Works on. Okay. If you take my example, fine, Professor Vaishali Kale and 4B students, what's the relationship between? How do you define the relationship? If you teaches. So Vaishali Kale teaches. And if you take from 4B, any one example, teaches Shweta. So this is the relation. Teaches is the relationship. Fine. So relationship defines the actual relation between the two entities. Fine. So another example is given here. Employee Franklin. So the name is Franklin, manages the research department. So this is a relationship between employee and department. So one employee entity is Franklin and the department is taken as research. So research is the entity from department entity type. Franklin is a entity from employee entity type. So what is the relationship between this Franklin and research here? What is the relationship?
Managers.
So manages is the relationship. So this is how you define the relationship between any two. Now relationships of the same type are grouped into a relationship type. So some time ago we have defined the term entity and entity type. What is the difference between entity and entity type? What is the difference between entity and entity type? Anyone?
Entity is an object and entity type is a set of entities.
Yes. So entity type is a set of entities. Similarly, relationship, when we talk about the word relationship, we are talking about a single instance. That means the relation between two single entities, not between the groups. Now, when such similar entities are grouped together and when such two groups exist and there is a common relationship, like for example, if you make BCA faculties as one entity and then I'm one, so see BCA faculties, let me type it here, that will be clear to you instead of imagining. BCA faculty is one entity type and then 4B students. So these are the two entity types. Now there is a relationship between. Now actually if you take one single instance from BCA faculty, so suppose here you take fine. So there is one entity from BCA faculty group, one entity from 4B students. So what's the relationship between these two?
BC
Teachers.
faculty teaches to 4B students.
Teaches. So VK teaches Shweta. Similarly, if you take Prakash Deshpande sir, like that, again teaches some other entity, something like that. So if you, okay, ignore individual entities, if you consider BCA faculty and 4B students. Among BCA faculties, again, if you take only those faculties who teach 4B students, then the relationship between these two entity types. So VK is one entity, Shweta is one entity, but BCA faculty is the entity type and 4B students is the entity type. Entity type means the group of entities. Now, when the two entity types share the common relationship, then then that relationship also becomes a group of relationships, isn't it? Like VK teaches Shweta, VK teaches Manisha, VK teaches Manish, VK teaches Sanjeev. So there are multiple relationships if you take up individual relationships. So such common relationships, if you combine, if you group them into one, then it is called as a relationship type. What is it called as? Relationship type. Fine. So relationships of the same type are grouped into relationship type. So works on relationship type in which the employee and project, these two entities participate. They say when there is a relationship works on between employee and project. See, employees works on project. So every entity from the employee group works on one entity from the project group, like that. Then similarly, there is one group called as employees and another group called as department. What is the relationship between employees and department? Employees, there could be multiple managers, fine, from the different departments. So when we take up individual entities, it is employee manages one particular department. So if you take up a group of such relationships together, it is called as relationship type. So what is the name of the relationship type? Manages between the entity type, employees and department. Fine. Yeah. So if it is clear, let's go ahead. So this is an example of relationship instances of works for. Now here it is not works on, it is not manages. There is one more relationship called as works for. So works for is a relationship type between the entity types, employee and department. So every employee works for some department. So E1 works for D1. E1 works for D1. So can you see here? E1 works for D1. So E2 works for D2. So the relationship between E2 and D2 is named as R2. So R2 is individual relationship. R2 is individual relationship between E2 and D2. R1 is a relationship between E1 and D1. So here, when multiple employees works for the same department. So can you see here, E3 also works for the same department D1 as E1 works. So E1 and E3, both of them together, they work for one department. Similarly, E6 also works for the same department. So that is possible. Multiple entities can be associated with a single entity in another entity type. Anyways, so this R1, R2, R3, R4, these are individual relationship, whereas works for is a relationship type. Fine. So this is the example of a relationship between employee and department. Employee works for department. Fine. Is it clear? So let's go ahead with the next example. So this is a relationship between employee and project. How do you define this relationship?
Works on.
Works on. It's written here. Employee works on project. So again, you can see here multiple employees are working on the same project. And sometimes this E2 is working on two different projects. He's working on P2 as well as working on P3 also. So that is also possible. It depends on what structure is followed in your organization. Fine. So this is how you represent the relationship. Now remember, this is not ER diagram. It is just a general representation how they define different types of relationships. Fine. When they ask you to write a 5 marks short note on relationships or types of relationships, we will discuss what are the types later. But if they ask you, then you have to represent using such diagram. Otherwise, this diagram is nowhere related to ER diagram. Remember that. Now, let us define the next term. What is degree of a relationship type? So what do you mean by degree of a relationship type? The degree term indicates degree of a relationship type is the number of participating entity types. So, participating entity types means the relationship is between how many entities. For example, works for is a relationship between which two entities? Works for, do you remember?
Employee and department.
Very good. Employee and department. So employee is one entity type, department is another entity type. So it is a relationship between the two entity types. And hence the works for relationship type is said to be of degree 2, or it is also called as binary relationship. What is it called as?
Binary relationship.
By indicates 2 value. Similarly, when sometimes there could be more than 2 entity types participating in a relationship. For example, here, supplier supplies parts to the project. So supplier supplies parts to the project. So here you can consider this supply is the relationship which is between 3 entities: supplier, project, and parts. When now this relationship supply is of degree 3, and hence it is also called as ternary relationship. So relationship type of degree 2 is called binary. Relationship between 3 entity types is called as ternary relationship. Clear with this? So there may be 2 marks question again asked in exam. What is the degree of relationship type? So you have to define and give this example. 2 examples you have to give, one of binary and one of ternary relationship. Now we'll go ahead with the next. Yeah. More than one this is just a note you should remember, because you are going to work on multiple queries later in the same case study. So you have to completely understand the case study. There could be more than one relationship type that can exist with the same participating entity types. For example, if you take manages and works for, so these are the 2 distinct relationships between employee and department. So if you consider here, employee and department. And here it is. Department. Now, what is one relationship between employee and department?
Manages.
Yeah, so employee, one is manages. Department. There is another relationship as per our case study. What is that?
Works for.
Works for. Very good. Works for. So there could be multiple relationship between the 2 same entity types. So this is possible. Fine. Now let's go ahead. There is one more relationship type. This is little complex, so all of you pay attention. we can have a recursive relationship. The term recursion you have already heard before. Can you define the term recursion?
A function calling itself repeatedly until some condition.
Yeah, a function calling itself. So the function calls itself, not any other. Normally one will be caller and another will be called, two different function, but here the same function is doing both the job. That is the caller and that is the called function. Fine, so it is doing double role. So similarly here, there could be a specific relationship in between, between the same two different groups of the same entity type. Like for example, if you say, yeah, this is a typical example taken here, supervision. Supervision in the sense, one who supervises. You can consider, take example of BCA employees. There is one coordinator or the supervisor. So who is coordinator of BCA department? Who is the HOD of BCA department?
Venu sir.
Venu sir. He will supervise other employees. So who are other faculties or employees? Like they are the teachers, they are the accountant, so many. Vittal sir is there, then Jyoti madam is there, instructors are there, we are there. So Venu sir is supervising employees. But who is Venu sir to the organization? If you consider on the broader level, so Venugopal sir is also an employee, but in a different role, isn't it? So here, if you generally consider, Venu sir is one entity, but even he is the employee and we are also employees. So employee is supervising employee. So here, if you consider the relationship between the entity type employee, so both the side employee only will come, only the role will change. One side, the employee is playing the role of a supervisor, and other side, the employee is playing the role of a worker. So here, this is a relationship between two different instances of the same entity type called as employee. So if you look at the diagram, it will be like this: employee and employee both the side, and in between it is supervising. So supervises. So if you say supervises, so this side will be Venugopal sir supervises others. So Venugopal sir is one example, but he belongs to the same group called as employee. So employee supervises employee. Fine. When this looks little odd to read, then instead of reading the entity type's name, we read the roles in which this entity type plays the or participates. So what is the role in which this supervision, this employee entity is participating in the supervision? There are two different roles. One role is of a supervisor and second role is of a subordinate. So you say one side it is supervisor, supervises the subordinate. Fine. So this is how in the ER diagram it is shown. In ER diagram, uh, actually the relationship between the two, yeah, before we discuss the recursive relationship notation of ER diagram, let us first see how the ER diagram, the notation for relationship. We have defined the term relationship. What is the ER diagram notation for relationship? Yeah, here. Please ignore other part, just concentrate on only this part. Okay, let me highlight that. Okay, here. There is which entity I am addressing here?
Employee.
And other side?
Department.
Yeah, the relationship between these two is, one relationship is?
Works for.
Yeah, how, what is the shape used to denote the relationship?
Diamond.
Diamond. So diamond is used to indicate the relationship. So remember, this is one more ER diagram notation to show the relationship. So when the relationship between two entities, and of course it will be joined with a straight line to the entities. It will be connected with the straight line between the participating entity types. Fine. Now, here you can see there is a typical relationship we just now discussed, which is called as recursive relationship. Which is this relationship here?
Supervision.
Supervision. So this relationship is between the two groups of the employee. So this is because it is recursive. The same entity type is participating in a relationship with itself. So this is called as recursive. In case of recursive relationship, it is not written. I mean, same entity is not written on both the sides. It is shown like the same entity is connected with two different straight lines of the two edges of that particular diamond. And when it is indicated with its straight line, how to read? It will be a confusion. Here you can read clearly this first relationship, which is binary. You can read it like this: employee works for department. But how will you read it here? So for reading, we indicate something called as a role names. So in which role that employee is playing or participating. So supervisor is one side role and another is supervisee. So employee as a supervisor supervises the supervisee or the worker. So what are role names? Role names are the roles in which the entity type participates in a relationship. Normally, these role names are not written in case of binary or ternary relationship. It is indicated, even this is binary, but here this is a typical recursive relationship. So role names plays important role in case of recursive relationship because they are very, very important to indicate here. So understood what are role names? Not much asked in exam, but just you should know. Fine. Yeah, with this, let us stop for today. Any doubts so far? So we have defined the terms here: entity type, then we defined relationship type, then we define domain, then we define degree of a relationship type, then we defined recursive relationship, and we also have seen what is a ER diagram notation for relationship. And we also saw what are role names. Fine. Any doubt in this? So all of you give your attendance quick.